You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast. Kristen and I think it's a very special treat when we get one of our favorite authors back again for a second time. Well, today we have an author back for the third time, and we're welcoming FIONA Davis here with us today. Welcome back.
Thank you. We did a hat trick, I guess, is what we call it in hockey, right? Yeah.
And we're very excited. We're here to talk about a book that's coming out on January 7th, the same day this podcast will air. It's called The Stolen Queen. I do have to admit, I think it's one of our favorites, although we did just read it, so it's fresh in mind. And we loved it, FIONA. Can't wait to dive down into it with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Before I do, we like to tell our listeners just a little bit about you. Now, I believe many of our listeners probably heard you the first two times, but it's still so interesting, your bio. You are the New York Times best-selling author of, are we up to 7 historicals, or would this be 8?
This is 8.
Yeah. Wow. All set in the iconic New York City buildings. This is what makes it so special. You're an expert of Manhattan. You live in Manhattan. Who could tell the story better? You also have had articles written in publications like the Wall Street Journal and Oprah Magazine, which is very impressive. I want to mention that your book, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, was a Good Morning America book club pick, which was well-deserved. And I think this one's headed in the same direction. You first came to New York as an actress. That's very intriguing. You fell in love with writing after you got your master's degree at Columbia Journalism School. Very impressive. And we're so glad that you changed careers, because here you are and we're enjoying your stories. Your books have been translated into, is it 20 languages now?
I think somewhere around there.
Yeah, that's incredible. So we're so happy to have you back with us here today, and we can't wait to tell our listeners all about The Stolen Queen.
I'm excited to talk.
Well, as Chris mentioned, we're here to talk about The Stolen Queen, which we absolutely adored. And FIONA, you may remember, I like to give our listeners a little bit of the story and what's going on in the background. And I won't give away any spoilers. But in this story, we are transported to Egypt in 1936, and we meet Charlotte Cross. She is an anthropology student. She is on an archaeological dig in the very famous Valley of the Kings. Many of us remember that because all these amazing discoveries were taking place between the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Now, she makes a very exciting find, and she also begins to build a family and a career while she is in Egypt. Now, just as the storm clouds are starting to gather for World War II, a tragedy happens, and she flees Egypt, and she vows never, ever to return. Now, fast forward to 1978 in New York City, and Charlotte is now working at the Met's very celebrated Department of Egyptian Art. She leads a quiet life. She likes to do her research. She's very good at what she does. Now, she's been working on some research and a theory, and it's about, I'm going to hopefully pronounce this correctly, Hathorkare, a rare, thank you, female pharaoh. And she's got a theory about her life and her importance that's a little different than what has already been developed in the research. So she is, with a little trepidation, looking forward to bringing that out into the light. Now, also in 1978, we meet 19-year-old Annie Jenkins. Now, Annie is, through a weird set of circumstances, she finds herself working for the Vogue fashion editor. I'm going to say Diana Vreeland, because that's how she wanted it pronounced. And Diana is a special consultant to the Met in the costume department, but she's also organizing the very famous Met Gala that is going on that year. Now, Annie is, again, through weird circumstances, ends up working for her and is at the Met quite a bit. She starts interacting with Charlotte, and the two of them ultimately team up together when a very, very important necklace called the Broad Collar goes missing during the Met Gala. So it's very exciting on several levels, but also even watching these relationships as they develop. Now, did you want to add anything? Because I want to say a little more, but I don't want to go too much into, what might be
No,
a spoiler.
you summed that up so well. That was very impressive. Yeah, that's right. And I think, to mention that Charlotte and Annie are kind of unwilling partners at first. They're very different in ages and temperament. And so it's a bit of an odd couple pairing.
So true. I did not want the story to end. As I said before we got started to Fiona, I love everything about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Met Gala. You bring both worlds with secrets, let me tell our readers, about what really goes on behind the scenes. It's so intriguing. I especially admired Charlotte's interest in similarities in the female Egyptian pharaoh Hathorkare.
You got it.
Hathorkare. Okay.
Really great.
Both women were marginalized in their roles because of their sex. Thousands of years apart, they lived. They both uncovered secrets about their past. Despite this difference in time period, you really showed the reader that women, even separated by thousands of years, are really far more alike than different. Charlotte longed to, and I'm going to quote this, give Hathorkare the acclaim she deserved, show the world what a woman could do when she was given a chance. Could you expand upon why Charlotte was so obsessed with uncovering that truth? And what does that even mean for women today?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And so Hathakare is based on an actual female pharaoh named Hatshepsut. And she was very interesting in that she became regent because the pharaoh, the male pharaoh, who was the direct line, was an infant. And so they needed someone to rule while the child grew up. So she became regent. She ruled really successfully for 20 years. And, there was economic peace and prosperity. There was trade with other countries. There was all these kind of innovations in terms of architecture. And, it was just a very good time in Egypt's history. And then it's very strange because after she died, all of her statues were hacked and demolished, and the reliefs that were carved into the buildings were just carved away. So there was very little sign of her. And for years, people, didn't really think twice about her. And then they found a quarry filled of all the pieces of her sculptures, and they put them together and realized, oh, this was an important woman. And this was in the 1900s. And at that point, they said, well, she must have, the Tutmos II, who descended after her, who followed her and was the infant. Once he grew up, they thought, well, he must have been really mad at her. She was his stepmom. And so he must have just smashed all these statues in anger. And in fact, the Met catalog in the 1950s, I believe, describes her as a vain, ambitious, and unscrupulous woman. And so, and they had no proof of this. And then later, a scholar realizes, oh, these were all smashed much later, right before Tutmos II was about to transfer power to his son. And so there were other reasons possibly for the decision to kind of hide the propaganda of a woman as a female pharaoh. And so there's a lot of levels to it, and Charlotte really digs into it. And to her, Hathorkare, I renamed the pharaoh because I had to change things in the timeline, and I make it very clear in the author's note what the fact and what the fiction is. But I just love the idea of this very enigmatic and very serious curator trying to find out what really happened. Why was she revered at first and then erased and then reviled and then suddenly reincarnated in a way? And just following that journey. And what's so interesting about it is that in ancient Egypt, women had a lot of rights, even more than some women have today. So, for example, you're able to divorce, you could own property. It was okay to have sex before marriage. That was no big deal. It was okay to have kids out of wedlock. There was this kind of freedom to it that Charlotte in the 1970s does not have. which is fascinating. So in the 70s, a woman couldn't get a credit card or a mortgage or a loan without a man's signature. And so I love kind of juxtaposing those two worlds as Charlotte does her research and digs into Hathorkare's legacy and how those two worlds collide. And I think it's just very interesting about how women's rights and voices have changed over time. That's always something I'm looking into exploring. And so this was the perfect way to show that.
It is fascinating that Hathorkare was trying to be marginalized through her image in history, but Charlotte was looking to redeem her in some way or to tell her true story. And I loved the description of your excavations in Egypt. And I want to add to that because you also showed us that these people had grocery lists. They studied the sky. They created a solar calendar. They had civil engineering and medicine. There were wedding announcements, medical prescriptions, grocery bills. It was so amazing to me. You must have done a lot of research on archaeological excavations as well.
No, I didn't go on any. I watched some on YouTube for sure. But I did go back to Egypt for a couple of weeks and I went there and took this wonderful tour. We went up the Nile. We, saw the mortuary palace that Hatshepsut built, which is really, really beautiful. It was an incredible trip. And just by doing a lot of reading and researching and talking to curators and archaeologists and Egyptologists, I hope I was able to get the flavor of what it was like to go back there and work there, especially in the 1930s when things were very different. And the thing about Egypt is so much is buried still. They're still uncovering so much information. And so to come upon the town, which is the one you mentioned, where they found all of these just, things that you would just throw away and how valuable they are today because they give us the sense of what daily life was like.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I was thinking about how a lot of that is also buried because we haven't been able to access certain parts of the world due to war or occupation. So I think there's so many more discoveries that remain to be unearthed, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Well, I wanted to ask you the magnificent broad collar. I'm so fixated on it because it was so cool in this book. It held a great power over Charlotte's life. And, she maybe attributed certain things that had happened or that she had observed to its power. And I wanted to ask you about that. First of all, why did it frighten her so much? And was she maybe projecting onto the collar some of her own, insecurities that maybe she didn't deserve good things in her life? And
That
maybe
is such a good question. Oh, yeah. I love the way you approach it. It's fascinating because after you write the book, you're kind of, you move on. And so it's like visiting old friends. So the way you just described it was really, you completely nailed it. So Charlotte is definitely a scientist. That's the way she approaches the world. And she comes across this beautiful broad collar in her dig when she's a young woman. And it turns out that there is a curse associated with the Hathorkare, with that pharaoh, that anyone who takes anything out of the country that belonged to her is considered cursed. And she doesn't do that, but circumstances mean that the broad collar does leave the country. And she has a terrible tragedy associated with the broad collar, which we won't give anything away. But I think it's that shock that she's a scientist who expects things in the world to go a certain way. And when she's really hit with a terrible personal tragedy, that's the way of attributing why it happened. You have to connect it with something to make it make sense because there's no way it could just have happened, that the loss she experiences could have just come out of thin air. And I think that's how she makes sense of the world. And then she lives in, she's a 19-year-old in the 30s. And so she's living in a time when people didn't really, there wasn't a lot of therapy or going deep into what just happened. So she leaves Egypt, flees back to New York to her parents, and they don't want to discuss what happened. And neither does, anyone new she starts to become intimate with. And so by repressing it, though, which is what she does, she just dives into her work and doesn't think about it. She never goes back to Egypt. And by doing that, she gives it great power.
Yeah.
And so I love that dynamic of this is a woman who, doesn't believe in curses, but when it comes to that broad collar, it is when she first sees it at the Met after not seeing it for many, many years, it really throws her off her game.
Yeah. By the way, that scene was very powerful and beautifully written. And you could feel that it was something that had been magnified over time. Like you said, she's suppressing certain things, but they grow and have a bigger, they occupy a lot of space in her life. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
But I was wondering if maybe deep down subconsciously, she needed to dive into the research because, like you said, to start making sense of things.
Yeah, I think so. I think she's hooked onto Hathorkare as someone who will show her the way, show
Yes.
her the way out, because right now her life is very small and very stagnant. And so by following this pharaoh, this rare female pharaoh who ruled all of Egypt for 20 something years, that will be her way out. And I have to say, after studying so much about Hathorkare myself, or Hatshepsut myself, the actual pharaoh, after I went to Egypt and went to a museum where her mummy basically lies in state, and you walk into this room and the lights are dimmed and you're supposed to be whisper because this is the female pharaoh who walked the earth at that time. And after having done all that research, I almost was in tears.
Yeah.
Here she is. Those are her fingernails. That's her hair.
Yeah.
It was, incredibly moving. And I think Charlotte goes through that same feeling as well.
No doubt.
That definitely came out in the story. That is a very special experience when you research someone from history to that extent. I'm sure you feel that you know her maybe in a special way that the rest of us do not. And to see her mummy as in that exhibit, we had a traveling mummy exhibit that went across the U.S. several years ago. And I remember entering it. I think I saw it in New York City. And they asked you to be very quiet because they said, please have respect. This is a burial ground for people. It does give you an eerie feeling, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you go to a museum and you see sarcophaguses and you see, jewelry and statues, but this is an actual person. So I think it does need to be respected.
Yes. I want to talk about something a little more fun, and that is the Met Gala in your story. So the collar was being used during the Met Gala. I don't think that's giving anything away, but we have this young and experienced Annie who is being hired to help with the Met Gala. She's bringing fresh and modern ideas to Diana Vreeland, who is a highly regarded at the Met Gala. And I just thought, looking at Annie's life, Annie has freed herself from her mother, who was very controlling and egotistic. Then she is submerged into a new relationship with Diana, who is also, let's be honest, very egotistic. And then I was wondering as a reader, maybe it wasn't the ego that was a problem. Was Diana willing to see something in Annie that maybe her mother couldn't even see or didn't want to see?
Oh, that's so interesting. I love Annie and I love that relationship between the two. And it was interesting working with Diana Vreeland because she is a real woman. So much of what she says in the book, she really said. And she was this quirky duck of a woman, a fashion icon, and then took over as special consultant to the Met Gala in the 70s and really changed it. So the Met Gala before then was this dowdy affair held in hotels like a luncheon. And then today, of course, it's this incredible celebration. And in fact, just to show how it changed, tickets in 1949 when it started were $50. And today there's 75,000. So it's really changed. So, and the 70s was when that change occurred because of Diana Vreeland. And I agree. I think Annie's mom, she's not a great role model by any means. She's very dependent on Annie. And Annie finally is able to make a break and take the job with Diana Vreeland. And Diana Vreeland, I wouldn't say she's egotistic, but I'd say she is a woman who is certain of what she believes. She has strong opinions. She's a very strong woman. In her youth, her mother would call her ugly. And because of that, the fact that this woman who was called ugly as a young girl grew up to run a fashion magazine. And she was a really interesting looking woman. She had black lacquered hair, very pale skin. She would rouge her cheeks as well as her earlobes. She was really, if you look up photos of her, she's very striking. And and so she had to figure out her way in a world where beautiful women were the ones that counted. And so I think she had great inner strength and a great sense of character and a sense of who she was in order to achieve what she did. And because of that, she's a tough boss, and Annie has no idea what she's doing. She really, as you said, stumbled into this job. And so in a way, I think Deanna Vreeland is teaching her how to is celebrate her own differences, Annie's, her own weaknesses and strengths, and figure out what they are, and be your own person, to reinvent yourself and take the world by storm. And so, but Annie, because she's used to this very codependent relationship, applies that to Deanna, and it doesn't work. And for a number of reasons, it goes terribly, terribly wrong. And then she has to write it. And that's her way, a kind of a rite of passage to grow up and learn who she is and stop seeing herself through other people's eyes.
And I'm not going to say what happens, but I love the scene where it goes terribly wrong.
It was so much fun to write. Because I, as an author, I thought to myself, okay, I need something to go wrong at the Met Gala. What's the worst thing that can happen? And
That's
then
about it.
you won't give it away, but it was fun.
I want to ask you a little bit about Charlotte's boyfriend. Now, she hated that word, so I'm using that kind of loosely here. He was kind, he was smart, he was supportive, he was always seeking to connect with Charlotte. And at one point, he describes his relationship with her as, and I'm going to quote, "where you keep secrets, and I'm wondering what you're thinking half the time." And I kept thinking about Charlotte. She's an anthropologist by training and schooling. She's a person who studies people, for a living. They're long gone people, but that's what she does. And why did she then keep the most important parts of her very guarded, where they had to be excavated?
I love your questions. This is really, because it's still early in kind of promoting the book. And so I haven't thought about it in this way. And you're just setting off all kinds of bubbles in my head about,
Good.
Really wonderful. So thank you. So yeah, so I think Charlotte, I love the idea that she excavates people and discovers these, ancient times, and that's safe because they can't hurt her, although they can throw a curse on her, unfortunately. But she's repressed everything that she's gone through, and so she can't react and interact with people in her world the way you would if you were just a healthy, strong individual. She's really been thrown for a loop when she was very young. And so she works for a curator who is, not as smart as she is. And she kind of is his underling and does everything right and fixes all the things that the chaos that he leaves in his wake. She's very capable, but no one really knows her, including her boyfriend, as you said. And I think it's because she's stuck in a rut. She knows she's stuck. She knows things aren't exactly right. And it isn't until Annie comes into the picture and things go very wrong in the Egyptian wing as well as at the Met Gala, and those two worlds collides, that she is forced to reassess what she wants out of life and what she's capable of. And having lived in the 60s and 70s, and when women were expected to be, especially for her earlier on, she would be growing up in the 40s, 50s. And that's when women were supposed to be secretaries or nurses or wives. And she didn't do that. She became this archaeologist, which was considered a little crazy and was very much a man's world. And so she's had to keep everything down. She hasn't been able to let her freak flag fly, which is, I think, deep down what she really wants to do. And with Annie and with the collision of things that happened at the Met that one night, she has to figure her way out and figure out who she is. So it's similar, I think, in as Annie's story. And so they both have to reassess the decisions that they made and decide who they want to be going forward.
Yeah, I love too that there was a certain amount of information and emotion that had to be unearthed, but not by a man. Right. And because there was such a cool parallel between what she did professionally, especially in the 1930s, but what needed to happen in her own life. It needed to be her and
Yes,
only her.
exactly. Exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Chris and we've been talking about this book actually for quite a while. We just loved it. And I think that listeners and readers are going to absolutely adore it. We encourage them to pick it up. It is always wonderful having you come back on the show. And if you don't mind, can you share a little bit of a clue of what you might be working on next? I know it's something you have to be careful about, but we would love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. It's still early days, but I'm working off a building in Upper Manhattan that no one's ever heard of. I've had maybe two or three people. It's the oldest house in New York City. It's called the Morris Jumel Mansion, and it's got an incredible history. And I feel like this is a place in a museum that needs some serious love. And so I'm building a book around it in the hope that they'll get all the acclaim that they deserve.
I love
Oh,
that. I
sounds
love that.
great.
Yeah, you're unearthing a history there. So
Yes. Yes,
very
exactly.
It's very cool. Well, listeners, you can find Fiona at FionaDavisBooks.com. She has a newsletter. She is on Facebook and Instagram. And we just encourage you to pick up this book. You're going to love it and you want to connect with her. And again, thank you so much, Fiona, for coming back for your three-peat. We, of course, want you to come back on the show in the future. And we just wish you all the best with this one.
Thank you
Thanks.
for these fantastic questions. You really made my day. I so appreciate it.
So
Well,
good
it's
to
because
see
you
you
wrote an
again.
amazing book.
Thank you.
Nice to see.
Kristen.
There's so many things I love about this book. Okay, of course, the Met Gala, of course, New York City. But we do, as a people, have a very big interest, even maybe an obsession with history. And
Yeah.
all the history museums and the Metropolitan Museum of Art historic wing. Why do you suppose that is that we're so enthralled, especially thousands of years ago? Do you think that we're surprised that we are so similar still?
Yeah, I think so, especially women and the challenges they've always faced 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, last week. And I love that she loved our questions, but I think that reflects a book where it does go deep. It does go deep into history, but also it reflects things happening right now, So I enjoyed it. I know you enjoyed it. You and I have many similar interests, and they're all in this book somehow.
So true.
Well, that's amazing. I want to tell our listeners about some other amazing authors that we have coming back on for the second and third time, some of them, which is kind of cool. We've got Elka Joshi, 6 Days in Bombay. In fact, she's coming back for a third time. Victor Mythos, The Silent Watcher. And Carter Wilson, Tell Me What You Did. Jill Shalvis, Better Than Friends. Mark Greaney, Midnight Black. Andrews and Wilson, coming on for the third time. Defense Protocol, Marshall Karp, Don't Tell Me How to Die, Brett Battles, writing for Stuart Wood's Golden Hour, Tess Gerritsen, The Summer Guest, Robert Cray, The Big Empty, Brian Freeman for Robert Ludlum, The Born Vendetta, Robert Dugoni, Hold Strong, coming back for a third time as well. We loved these books. We hope you pick them up. I think you'll really enjoy them. And listeners, thank you for sharing our socials. We are excited that you are on board with us. You know that you can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on X. You can find us at BOOKSTORMPodcast.com. And of course on YouTube, where you can see videos of all of these fantastic authors. Just search for Bookstorm and Podcast, and we should come right up. Till next time, listeners, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.